So, moving on from kind of the transition, and these always there's some overlap, and many people are interested to know how these kinds of things occur. Um, you know, even the band and tribal level people knew what plants were, they knew what seeds were, they knew they needed water, they needed sun. A lot of times, again, we project this ethnocentric idea that, oh, humans just hadn't figured things out yet. Yes, they did know. Foraging and hunting and gathering was just an easier life. It was functional. It made more sense. Um, Gardens start up as, and again, another term for that is horticulture. Even the natives around this area, they tended the native tobacco. So, in terms of the concept of agriculture, they were doing agriculture or horticulture, and they were definitely focused on the gardens, and they were focused on the gardens of tobacco. Um, and again, we look at, in terms of archaeological evidence, we're looking at gardening starting about 12,000 to 15,000 years ago. And we could start to get into more intensive gardening, and it may have been, again, natural things that, like in this area, blackberries, may have been here for a very long time, and the natives may have kind of semi-gardened them. Um, but we're not going to have evidence of that because there's not extensive agriculture, so we're not going to find fields or evidence of walls, and those things just didn't exist. So there may have been little gardens here and there. We just haven't found them in the archaeological record. So with gardens, though, in tribal to chiefdom levels, we're starting to build in numbers, right? So we're going to be able to support more people, but this becomes more intensive, not extensive. It doesn't require more land, it actually requires less, but it requires more labor and tending to that land. So crop rotation and dependence on weather becomes huge here, right? Remember, early band tribal level groups, if there was you know a shortage of rain or water, or even acorn crop, people would move, um, and they would move around, and California is a perfect example of that. Our language groups come from all over the place. 4 to 5 major language groups that were developed in other places that ended up moving into California, and it's obviously because one, they were just into adventure. Two, they realized that the life would be easier here. And again, this plays out in today's world. So many people still move to California because of the life. Now, I'm not saying that price of living is making that easier, but in terms of the land and what provides, it's a decent natural place, minus the drought situation. But again, we have 39 million people living here. So uh, again, this is a gardening idea. So those of you in the class who are gardeners, you're horticulturalists, and I garden myself. So I also know that it can be very intensive. It's much more intensive than me going out and gathering a bunch of acorns or buckwheat or whatever else I need to gather to eat at night. It's big payoff, but then we have to deal with things like food storage, right? And then we have to deal with gophers or mice or rats or any other species that might affect that crop, right? Because we've become dependent on that crop. This also forms what we call sacred land. So when we have more intensive gardens, we tend to be more sedentary, which means we're not moving around for crops, right? The natives here in Tehachapi would live in certain areas during the summer and certain areas in the winter, and that had everything to do with different crops and foodstuffs available to them. And yes, they had sacred land, but it was all in the different locations. These individuals who start to garden more are going to make sure that the mountain that is next to the garden is also sacred so that they don't leave. It becomes a more permanent structure. We start to get in more clearly defined gender roles in this area as well. Women tended to do the gardening, men tended to hunt and forage. Now remember, foraging and hunting are going to supplement this gardening nutrition thing. So this is still an important factor. Individuals in band levels and tribe levels moving into chiefdoms were still semi-healthy because they still had these processes involved. I put manioc and cassava here. These are early gardened crops. and are important to groups in the Americas, a lot in South America. But these are like tubers. Um, and we start to also get families claiming land, but don't necessarily own it. So they work the land, but they're not saying that it's private property yet. Okay, so we're not moving into private property. Chiefdoms and Native Americans didn't have that concept of private property. Um, Many times we have, in terms of political organization, we had big men or big women. Now, this would possibly form out of the headmen and headwomen, right? The temporary leadership role could turn permanent, but it's based on prestige of individuals. And this is typically, some anthropologists use this as an in-between of tribal level individuals where there's headmen and chiefdoms. And chiefdoms are different in terms of status. Chiefdoms pass down their power or status through their bloodline. Big men are basically put in power because they tend to have more wealth or prestige than others. So again, if a situation arose, you could see, oh, look at, we need a temporary leader to get us through this conflict or this issue. We pick a headman and or woman, and let's say then that we're comfortable with that individual making those decisions for us. We then turn that power over to that individual, and that person would become a big man or a big woman. And after they pass on, either the group's going to go back to self-leadership or self-government, or they're going to pick another big man and big woman. But if they picked ultimately the son or daughter of that big man or big woman, now we're starting to get into a chiefdom, because that is a scribe status. That person or individual is not working up their way in terms of wealth or achieve status. They're not achieving something. They're just born into it, which is like what the monarchs of England are currently. So again, this is an important distinction. Big men and big women were put there, basically voted on, right? And to be honest, this is what we have in our system, right? The president and our senators, they're basically big men and big women. They have earned status, hopefully through prestige, but definitely we have turned over the power through the vote for them to represent us. And so you'll see that the modern founding fathers basically have added back in some of these things that get us a bit more back towards egalitarianism or equality, but having us have some power over that situation as individuals in that society or culture is important. The MOCA was is an interesting kind of strategy for developing political leadership. It involves gift giving and exchange and sponsorship of large feasts. We're going to talk about the potlatch in the United States. The Northwest coast use the potlatch, and they use this for a similar reason. In order for the chief to maintain power and prestige, they would basically have to throw these big festivals and parties to gain that prestige or power. So again, so far in terms of a recap, we have band level groups that are egalitarian, equal in status. Everybody made decisions, at least if you were an adult, right? Children weren't part of that decision-making process because they had not achieved that status yet. But if you were an adult with adult status in a band level society or even small tribes, you had the power, and it was egalitarian or equal. Once we move into tribal level groups that maybe are a bit bigger and they pick a headman or a headwoman for temporary power, now we're starting to get some of those power issues that come about. In the big man, big woman situation, remember, this is a more permanent role, right? Big men and big women may have their role as a big man for their life, and then they die, okay? But it's for life, it's not temporary. So now you're seeing power, how it's placed and transferred is important. Pastoralism, there are tribes and chiefdoms around this sustainability process. And when we talk about in terms of how they're surviving, they are surviving on animals. Okay, they're herding animals, domesticated animals. So again, we're looking at 12,000 years ago as kind of being this time period, maybe a little bit further back. Sheep, goats, camels, horses, those kinds of animals are going to be kind of herded. Reindeer, they're going to be herded, and they're typically nomadic. So they do not have a stationary location because they have to take these animals to feed in different places. They must trade in order to have a balanced diet because they're not necessarily foraging for plant stuffs. They're reliant on these animal products, and this could be milk or meat, right? But we cannot just survive on those things. In fact, early humans had a hard time utilizing just one type of diet, and especially milk, right? We had to develop that lactase enzyme. Um, they are family unit based. So it's usually the family that's running things. They could be more clan, right? Bigger size. Um, and men are more responsible for the moving animals, and then women were responsible for processing the animal products. So again, here we have clear division of labor in these groups. We also have the interesting concept of ownership. Ownership comes about in pastoralism because now we have ownership of animals. They don't necessarily own the land, but they own the animals. Okay, very important. Chiefdoms are going to come about also in this group, composed of a number of villages. It's bigger than a tribe, right? We're looking, it could be from that tribal level of 5,000 all the way up to 50,000. They could be very big. And usually the power is inherited from father and passed down to son. This is a scribe status, right? Also, we have some religious rituals and beliefs that serve to confirm the chief's authority. The chief is also the enforcer of the laws. And again, some of the issues with missionaries kind of mixing or coming to these groups of people, they would show up, and this happened in the Northeast all the time. Missionaries would show up and say, I want to talk to your leader. Well, they didn't actually, in these egalitarian groups, they didn't know who the leader was. So they would put a woman forward, and then they'd say, no, I want to talk to the leader, the man. So then they would put a man forward, and ultimately, even though he did not have the power, this group would start calling this person the chief. And then that person would start to assume that power role because this group, this other outside group, would only discuss issues with them. So they have basically created a chief power structure within these egalitarian societies. But it is important to know that chiefdoms are sedentary for the most part. Large pastoral chiefdoms probably did exist, but for the most part, they are sedentary. They're going to have a location. They have sacred land, which could be a sacred tree, it could be a sacred mountain, it could be a sacred river, but chiefdoms are also important in this development. Agriculture or ancient modern societies, again, if we grow out horticulture, the little gardens, and we start to be sedentary and we stay there, and then you add in some of that pastoralism idea of ownership of animals, now we put a fence up around the animals, now we put a fence up around the garden, we basically have an ancient modern state. And the way that this grows out of these horticultural or pastoral ideas is simply that, you know, if we have all this food, right, in this garden has produced a lot of food. Now let's say that the neighboring tribe goes hungry, right? There's not enough rain, they don't get food, they can't forage. They come to us for food, and maybe the first couple times we give them food because we feel bad because they're neighbors. After that, we're going to say that they owe us something, right? Like, well, what are you going to do for us in return? Well, the simple process there is that we turn them into laborers. So we say, well, we'll give you food, but you have to live here and help us with the land. Well, now we've grown our population and we've actually grown our labor force. So now we can extend our land. Now we have agriculture. We have intensive land use, which means we're going to plant, just like this field in this picture, we're going to plant using all of this labor, and we also need the domesticated animals to help us with that. And what we get out of this is men do most of the farm work, women are also going to do the processing and the domestic duties. But we get private property, we get laws to ensure that the private property is put in place. So we've moved out of the public property realm and into the private property realm. And again, it's bad for the environment and health, at least in the short term, because you're relying on one food product typically. And our early ancestors really focused on barley and wheat, the grains, which made us unhealthy because we were not getting vitamin D and other vitamins from bugs and other things that we were gathering. We also created inequality during this time period. Wealthy landowners make out the best because now they have, again, power over other individuals. Okay. The state, again, 5,000 years ago, even further back, if we go earlier, I think the earliest kind of city that we're looking at is in the 9,000 BCE range. So we're really looking at kind of maybe 11,000 years ago, but it wasn't super gigantic. Most modern states come into existence after World War II. Currently, there's 196, and this number has gone up, I believe, independent states around the world. No one person is the law, but the state is responsible for law and law enforcement. And again, this is agriculture is the main subsistence, right? But we have division of labor, we have power structure, we have hierarchy, as you can see in this picture here with the pharaoh. And this is going to just act as a gigantic chief with private property, where the pharaoh is going to pass down their power through the bloodline, right? Division of labor is big in terms of status based on labor.